Number 10. The Dazezhan Uprising. Skipping ahead a bit into the future, following the, spoilers, death of Qin Shi Huang, there were a bunch of uprisings. Also known as the Chen Sheng and Wu Guang Rebellion, named after its respective leaders, the uprising began when two officers were ordered to lead their soldiers to defend Yueyang. Halted by flooding, they realized that due to Qin laws, being late for their government job would result in their executions without respect for the excuse. So they did what anyone would do. Rile up the peasants and go for a good old revolution. Better than getting slaughtered for missing a shift, right? Well, they thought so, and managed to get around 900 peasants to back their cause. How they did this isn't completely confirmed, but there are two stories about how they might have gone about the process, and both are really weird. See, one story goes that Chen Sheng and Wu Guang wrote the words King Chen Sheng on some silk, and then fed that silk to a fish. When the fish was purchased and presumably cut open by soldiers, they saw the message and thought it was sick. Another story goes that they supposedly taught animals to say Da Chu flourishes, King Chen Sheng, which likely would have had a similar effect on anyone who heard that from like a cow. So now, these might be slightly embellished, but they're also really funny, so come on. Either way, they got stopped by the Qi, so it doesn't really matter. Number 9. The War of Unification. While technically pre-Empire, the Qin Wars of Unification are sick and nobody can stop me from talking about them. Prior to their campaign, the relatively small state of Qin had evolved to gain a surprising degree of prominence, becoming one of the 7 major states in power at the time. Now this was due to the numerous battles centuries prior that I can't talk about this time, but I promise they were really cool. One of which was actually credited as basically being responsible for the unification of China, despite it having occurred like 40 years prior. Just look up the Battle of Chongping, it was wild. In any case, the War of Unification was a result of this, running from 230 to 221 BC. It saw Ying Zheng declaring war on the states of Han, Zhao, Wei, Yan, and Qi, conquering them in just about that order. This led to a complete unification of China, an effort which only took barely a decade to complete. Number 8. Getting owned by a peasant. We're getting outside of the actual reign of the Qin again, but I don't care. The Qin dynasty post-death of Qin Shi Huang was an absolute mess. Leaders were desperately trying to consolidate power, body their opposition, and avoid getting bodied in the process. The effective orchestrators of the chaos, Li Si and Zhao Gao, who we will get to, had a massive falling out which resulted in Li Si's execution. Zhao Gao was trying to run everything, deposing the old emperor in favor of a new one, who then got rid of Zhao Gao. But the new emperor, Jiying, was a moron, and so eventually a real revolt broke out in 209. The rebels of Chu, led by Lieutenant Liu Bang and leader Zhang Yu, managed to defeat Jiying in 207 BC. Of course, in traditional period fashion, Liu Bang betrayed Zhang Yu and founded the Han Dynasty, despite being a peasant. I have been in car accidents that have had less whiplash than the last, 2 years of the Qin Dynasty. Oh, and Liu Bang was a peasant, by the way. A peasant who became the ruler of China. Number 7. The Terracotta Warriors. Okay, so you probably know a little bit about this one. In 1974, a bunch of farmers in the Lintong County managed to dig up this exceptional find. 3 pits containing statues of 8,000 soldiers, 130 chariots with 520 horses, and 150 cavalry horses. Construction on the tomb began during Qin Shi Huang's reign. He had a thing about dying, but we'll get into that later. And the soldiers were originally painted, though due to the climate and about roughly 2 millennia of time, it kind of faded. There have been arguments that some of the paint could have been sourced from Greece, although the idea that the Greeks in the Qin dynasty ever made content is hotly contested, so I'm not getting into that. But it can't really be stated in words how massive this project was. Every every soldier was armed. Every single one constructed by hand, and the tomb itself is about 98 square kilometers, or 38 square miles for the Yanks in the audience. Easily one of the single most impressive pieces of architecture known to man. It's just yet another impressive reminder of the exact scale and scope of the Qin dynasty. Number 6. The 12 statues. Alright, story time! So, when Qin Shi Huang defeated the 6 other states in his quest for dominance, he demanded that every single conquered state hand over all of their weapons to him. He then melted those weapons and reportedly had them cast into 12 massive metal statues and a couple of bells or something. Each were reported to weigh about 1,000 dan, or roughly 133,000 pounds. Now, where are these colossi now? Well, a few centuries after the fall of Qin, Emperor Dongzhuo reportedly had about 9 of them melted down to make coins. However, because the statues were made out of a hodgepodge of different metals, and more importantly because Dongzhuo was a moron, the coins didn't weigh the same, which resulted in the mass devaluing of all copper cash. I really want to do a video on Lu Bu, and specifically how he offed Dongzhuo. That guy was a creep. Anyways, as for the other 3 statues, nobody really knows where they are, so maybe there's another discovery on a similar level to the Terracotta Warriors on the horizon. Number 5. Book burning. This is one of the more tragic stories, but it's got to be talked about. During Qin Shi Huang's rule, Chancellor Li Shi convinced the emperor that all records excluding the Qin needed to be burned. Not only that, but anyone possessing copies of the Shijing, the Shujin, and or any other writings from the 100 schools of philosophy had to turn their copies in for summary roasting or they'd get whacked. Not only that, but he suggested a mass state of censorship, which was the actual censorship and not the kind that you right-wing morons whine about happening in video games or whatever. Basically, anyone who referenced the books, talked about them in any way, or God forbid used them to criticize the government, were to be borked brutally and quickly. Qin Shi Huang thought this was a great idea and got to work erasing thousands of collections of poetry, history, and philosophy. He even went out of his way to execute 460 scholars whom he just happened to overhear complaining about his stupid new rules. I would weep about this loss for hours, but poet Zhang Ji's work titled Pits for Book Burning is far better for it than I. Quote, "As the smoke from burning bamboo and silk clears, the empire is weakened. The Hanggu Pass and the Yellow River guard the domain of Qin Shi Huang in vain. Pits of ash were not yet cold, disorder reigned east of the Zhao Mountains. As it turned out, Liu Bang and Zhang Yu could not read." Number 4. High-speed cultural revolution. We've said it already, but it really can't be overstated that the speed in which Qin Shi Huang implemented new cultural rules and laws was absolutely incredible. Even the Meiji Restoration period that effectively brought Japan into what was considered the modern age for that time, it took about around 21 years. And that was a messy affair that could get an entire video by itself. But consider the relative population contained within China. Consider the size of China and the size of the Qin Empire. All of this territory was shaped by a period of about a decade and a half, to the point where it wouldn't be until 1912 that there would be a major upheaval to this system. Obviously, it saw improvisation, adaptation, and change over the years, but just as Qin Shi Huang was laying the foundation for a wall that he envisioned would span the entirety of China, I wonder if he knew that the system of government that he was implementing would last nearly as long. Of course, the means by which this was achieved involved massive cultural manipulation and fascistic ideals, not to mention the body count. Actually, no, let's mention that. Number 3. The body count of Qin rule. Okay, now while the Qin dynasty was important, it should be noted that the results of such a tyrannical rule were bloody indeed. Between high taxes, wars of conquest, and the beginning of the construction of the Great Wall, historians estimate that around 20 million people passed during Qin rule. An absolutely staggering number given, again, its decade and a half duration. The construction of the wall alone was estimated to have contributed to around around 1 million of those, and it wasn't finished until long after Qin fell. It's a sobering reminder to keep in mind that while acts of war are devastating, the management or mismanagement of those in power can be far more destructive. Number 2. Xinjihuang's quest for immortality. So it turns out it ain't great to be king. As his reign continued, Xinjihuang's paranoia increased, only emboldened as 3 consecutive attempts on his life were made. This paranoia turned to obsession with the elixir of life, a fabled drink which might imbue him with immortality. His quest led him on a search for the Penglai Mountain, where a 1,000-year-old magician had supposedly invited him. Qin Shi Huang had also ordered an expedition to search for the elixir, but they never returned, likely due to being afraid of the consequences for returning empty-handed. It's actually suspected that some of them did escape to Japan and may have settled there, though accounts in this area are pretty weak. Anyways, in 211, a meteor landed in Dongjun, and some cheeky bugger inscribed the words, "The first emperor will die and his lands will be divided." Since nobody took credit for the masterful prank, everyone in the area was executed, and the stone destroyed. Finally, Qin Shi Huang passed, potentially due to illness, but as many fun stories go, it's actually rumored that he was killed by a seditious physician with a false elixir containing mercury. Number 1. Lixis Return. It's fortunate that the end of the Qin Empire is as interesting as its beginning. Qin Shi Huang is dead, and Li Shi and Chief Eunuch Zhao Gao have to somehow keep everything together. For starters, there was the job of getting the emperor's body back, which they handled by hiding it in a caravan of dead fish. Seriously. But they had another problem. They just flat out didn't want the emperor's choice of successor, Fu Su, to take the throne, as it'd probably mean that they'd lose their jobs. So betraying the newly passed emperor, they tricked Fu Su into taking his own life by giving him a falsified document from his dad that just told him to do it. Zhao Gao then betrayed Li Shi, charging him with treason, and the conspirator was subjected to the 5 punishments. Mo, where the offender is tattooed on the face with ink; Yi, where the offender's nose is cut off; Yue, where the offender's feet are cut off; Gong, where the offender's are removed; and finally Da Pi, which was carried out by chopping at the waist. It'd be easy to say that Li Si was half the man he aimed to be, but just please cut the joke here, that was really stupid.
Eating with the rich starts off the countdown at number 10. Medieval recipes depict a large variety of animals being served. Adding to the ones I listed previously are horses, lampreys, cranes, and crows. Hell, even beavers. And let's not forget the animals created by their chefs. One homemade animal was called a cockatrice, and it was actually multiple animals' bodies put together before being roasted. A helmeted cock was another chef creation. It was a roasted chicken wearing a tiny helmet that was sat on the back of a roasted pig, because why not? Dinner in a show is always fun, so in late medieval Europe, it became fashionable to have an entremetta, which was an entertainment dish. One such example is bakers cooked a pie shell in advance, and then after it cooled, they placed live birds inside the pie and resealed it. When cut at the table, the birds would then all fly out of the pie, much to the amazement of the many banquet guests, assuming that all went accordingly. FIFA fans may want to skip out on this next one, because number 9 in our countdown is making football illegal. That's right, while I may be referring to it as primarily soccer in this video, what was still called football at the time was made illegal in the medieval ages. Now there are quite a few reasons for this. Most popularly known is that the sport was extremely different then. It was violent and aggressive, resembling more of a mass brawl with minimal rules. However, it was also because only 2 years after soccer was banned in 1363, King Edward III would implement a mandatory archery education law. This would ensure his villagers could be used as soldiers should need be. King Edward believed that soccer, but also sports in general such as handball, football, hockey, and cockfighting were distractions, and at that time they could be doing better things. I'm sure there are many of you that would disagree. Next on the countdown is number 8, the future predicting Friar. There's a lot to unpack here, so I'll just jump right in. English Franciscan monk Roger Bacon is known through history for his shockingly accurate predictions of the future transportation and life life that we have now. Bacon lived from 1214 until 1292 and was the successful creator of the magnifying glass. But he also famously predicted future machinery in his book Espetola de Secretis Operibus, if I got that right. Cars can be made so that without animals, people will move unbelievably rapid. And flying machines can be constructed so that a man sits in the midst of a machine, revolving some engines by which artificial wings are made to beat in the air like a flying bird. It's a little nonsensical, but you can see what he's implying. His other predictions included steamships, submarines, diving suits, and telescopes. That's pretty spot on for a guy who lived thousands of years ago. This is the same man who was also said to have sculpted a prophetic head of brass. Apparently, having been warned by a spirit that he must listen to whenever the head first spoke, Bacon set his assistant Miles to watch over the sculpture, which he did even past Bacon's demise. It's said that after the friar's death, however, that was the first time it spoke. First saying, "Time is," then time passed. Ignored both times by a confused Mile, the head spoke only once more to say time is past before it exploded into flames. And so the chance to consult the mysterious head was lost when it combust. What do you think of the legendary Bacon and his stories of mysticism? Time is past, as the sculpted head said, so let's be happy we left this weird tradition in the past. In at number 7 in the countdown, it's the medieval animal trials. Under the ruler's power, there was no exception to medieval law, and so it should come as no surprise that even animals could face the brunt of their alleged crimes. This was no casual affair. The rich and the poor gathered for these trials as spectators. Some of the accused animals were even dressed in wigs and gloves, fancy garments to be seen in front of the royal court as their fate was debated by the lawmakers. That should come as no surprise either, seeing as the medieval era wasn't exactly overflowing with entertainment outlets. There are records of at least 85 animal trials that had taken place during medieval/Middle Ages. And while the most serious offenders were pigs by a landslide, there are records of some roosters and even one donkey facing the judge. What were these animals being charged for, you may be asking? Many times it was the act of attacking or eating humans, as food and grain for animals was so sparse they'd often go hungry. There were also some accused of being heathens or thieves or behaving in lustuous ways. So make sure you have a walking buddy and always look over your shoulder, because I guess you never know when an ill-intentioned cow may be creeping up on you. Number 6 in the countdown is the St. Galaska Day Riot. February 10th of 1355, a group of students who attended Oxford University decide to go into town for a pint at the Swindlestock Tavern. Little did they or anyone else know that this would be the start of a notoriously famous riot. It started with belligerent complaints to the tavern owner about the quality of their drinks and service. As the tavern owner was progressively more berated, he and other patrons lost their temper with these students. The escalation led to a verbal sparring between the students and bar patrons. Both sides ended up arming themselves, but luckily, things were quickly interrupted when the mayor stepped in and demanded the arrest of the students who had harassed and assaulted the tavern owner, thus sparking this whole disaster. What should have been a peaceful resolution caused a chain reaction, however. Oxford students rose up in protest of their peers' arrest and swarmed to attack the mayor. News of that quickly spread, and the townsfolk revolted immediately. Many of them were already very tired of these students and their entitled complex, and had been waiting for the opportunity to rage against them. The riot that occurred ended the lives of 63 students and 30 locals. While the case's investigation led to Oxford winning against the town in court, the Oxford Council was still made to parade shamefully through the village every year on February 10th, and they did have to pay a fine to the families of each student lost. For number 5, we're getting a little spicy with risqué's men's clothing. Now, you may have already heard stories or seen memes about ridiculously long pointed shoes and groin-flattering armor, but did you know that provocative men's clothing was all the rage for a period of time in the medieval era? It's recorded that in the late 14th century, men were quite keen to be seen in overtly short tunics and thin tights. By 1463, a modesty statute had to be passed, as men had upgraded to wearing cod pieces publicly, which did cover their mostly exposed genitals, but only by making them look cartoonishly large and bulbous in the process. A similar escapade happened with the Krakow shoe. These long, pointy-ended shoes were sometimes so long that they had to be tied back around the wearer's ankles or reinforced inside with a whalebone. The same statute in 1463 also addressed limiting these krakow shoes for those reasons. Seems like there may be a little bit of a compensation theme here. Both provocative dressing and shoe length were limited to those of extreme wealth after the statute passed, but that didn't stop the development of some more outlandish beauty standards. For example, number 4 in our countdown is Plucked Bear. Nowadays, whether you're scrolling through an app or walking down the road, you're likely to see advertisements for eyelashes and hair accentuation services. And while that may be pretty trendy and normal to us, now, in the medieval ages, having hair on your face would have actually made you stand out in a crowd. Women would remove their eyebrows, eyelashes, even significantly reduce their hairline so as to achieve a smooth egg-like effect. This was because the forehead was considered the center point of the face for many years, and so it would make sense to remove anything on or around it so as to accentuate it, right? Maybe. Moving on. If you're tired of her plucking herself bald, and she's tired of you wearing shoes that enter a room before you do, then maybe it's time for a good old-fashioned medieval divorce by combat. That's right, you heard me. Coming in at number 3 is divorce by combat. This finding was discovered in a historic German manuscript that laid out rules as to how divorce by combat was to proceed. Their decision to use combat as a means to solution was not unusual for medieval Germany, as trial by combat was part of their law system. Trial by combat was legally sanctioned duel that ensured whomever was to win the fight was deemed right. There are many ways that these duels could be fought, and various weapons and locations in which to have them. The divorce by combat trial was placed when a man was put into a 3-foot deep hole with one hand tied behind his back. The woman, however, would have a normal ground and be able to move freely. This was believed to ensure a fair fight between the sexes. Now, there is some evidence that the outcome of these trials could still end in death, even if the death was not as a result of the combat. It's said that if the man lost to his wife, he would be taken from his hole and executed in the town square. If the woman lost, she would be then placed in the hole and then buried alive. So yeah, I'd say maybe try talking it out a little bit first before resorting to a public throwdown that can end in death. And while we're on the topic of trials, number 2 on the countdown is Trials of the Dead. Who would have such a vendetta with the dead that they would have them unburied to stand a trial? Well, new Pope Stephen, that's who. In 897, the months-old body of Pope Morpheus, the first pope to ever be executed, was extracted from his grave to serve trial for his alleged usurping of papacy. The new pope donned the corpse in elaborate robes and even assigned a deacon for defense. You may be wondering why the new Pope Stephen had done this to his predecessor. Since a holy person's body was considered to become a holy relic in death, it became a holy rite to display their corpse in public tombs or churches so petitioners may still visit their former saint to leave tokens or deliver prayer. What better way to ensure that you have devoted attention of the community than a postpartum smear campaign where your opponent can't defend themselves because, well, they're dead. Stephen found the deceased Pope from Morpheus guilty so that he could toss his body into the Tiber River, as nobody can venerate his relic if his body is lost at sea. That's a pretty intense way to usurp the person who had the job before you. Joke's on Stephen, however, as shortly after this trial, he was executed just like his predecessor, making him once again come in second to Morpheus. Call it karma. With that dose of crazy, we can move on to medieval madness, which ranks at number 1 in our countdown. What was the medieval madness? Well, if you're a fan of rye bread, you may not want to listen in on this. In an era without refrigeration systems as well as poor hygiene, produce was left to natural elements. As a result, mold and bacteria growth was common and would of course migrate into food. Ergot mold is the most well known for its effect on the brain. It caused wild hallucinations and extreme emotional changes as the chemicals in your brain became imbalanced. The consumption of this mold and bacteria has had a variety of exclusively unpleasant side effects, such as vomiting, diarrhea, convulsions, delayed visions, even mania and psychosis. These symptoms make it obvious as to why this could be labeled as a madness. The extreme cases of ergot consumption would of course lead to things such as loss of limb, gangrene, or death. And this connection between molding rye flour and ergot poisoning wouldn't be made until 1670. So for hundreds of years beforehand, commoners saw ergot poisoning to be things like demonic possession. Many theorize and connect the medieval madness to that of the time periods of the witch trials. The trials began in 1691 1891, a year of intensive wet and cold which produces a higher level of ergot. They ended abruptly in 1693, a year said to be sparse on rye grain. If there's less to consume, there's less ability to be poisoned, making it arguable that there could be a connection between the two, especially as a side effect of ergot poisoning could be mistaken as demonic possession as previously mentioned, and that is also seen as a symptom of witchcraft. Still, this may not be the kind of bread you want to chase.
Number 10. First open heart surgery. Okay, going back to ancient Egyptians, why not? We're on a little track here. So they would clean the entire body out and then they would put the heart back in. Now, of course, they weren't alive during any of this, obviously. But when was the first ever open heart surgery? When did the impossible become a reality after this? Well, the first successful open heart surgery after mummification went down in Chicago in 1893. The patient was a man named James Cornish. He got a knife wound to the chest during a brawl. The surgeon, Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, who by the way used to be a shoemaker's assistant, he saved this man. This is how he did it. In the city's first interracial hospital too, might I add, there weren't many textbooks on this type of operations at the time, so the odds of survival here were low. In fact, there weren't any odds at all, being the first. At this point in time, there were no x-rays, no antibiotics, no anesthesia, and also no problem. Apparently, using just a scalpel, Dr. Williams cut through his chest, weaved through nerves, muscles, ribs, you name it, until eventually he closed a severed artery near the heart. Now, Cornish survived, and come 1894, Williams was promoted, obviously, to chief surgeon at the Freedmen's Hospital in Washington, D.C. Yeah, I didn't remember hearing those details in school. Probably would have fainted at my desk. Number 9. Mummification. Back in the ancient Egyptian times, of course, mummification was common. And even today, we're finding more mummies. It's pretty exciting. We're uncovering more ancient history every day. But how the hell was mummification done? Obviously, we can't talk about this in school because we're a little too young and maybe it's a little frightening. So, warning, it's a little gross. We've talked about teeth worms and trepanation, so I don't know. I feel like you're prepared. Well, for starters, mummification wasn't cheap. Being mummified was reserved for the rich. Now, it's pretty brutal, but what you would do is you would put a hook in your nose and then you would pull out your brains. All of the brains and the mushy stuff, just right out of your head. And then you would cut the left side of the stomach open, remove all of those goods, all those organs, gone, easy. And then while those are drying, you would put the lungs and the liver in jars. So ancient Egyptians, that's why they needed a lot of jars. You gotta put lungs and organs in it. And then you put the heart back in the body and then wash the insides out with wine and spices, all that good stuff. And then you would cover the body in salt for 70 days. Now around day 40, you would stuff in some sand, and then come day 70, that's when you would wrap them finally in the mummy bandages. And then the sarcophagus finally awaits. Those jars of organs were also stored in the burial chamber. So if you watch The Mummy and they're, making somebody a mummy and they're like moving around, no, it wasn't like that at all. It took 70 days. It was a long, exhausting process. Number 8, Bridget Bishop. Okay, getting some witchy nonsense for this one. Back in 1692, 500 people lost their lives due to smallpox. This happened after Europeans brought the disease to North America, and in result, you would get covered in these sores, these pimple-like bubbles. It was really uncomfortable. So rather than recognize the situation as symptoms from a disease, the people of Salem at first thought, oh, they're probably cursed, they're probably witches, hence why they're acting odd. The small Massachusetts village began this wave of hysteria with 2 young women, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams. They started to show signs of the disease. They were convulsing, acting strange, talking nonsense. Obviously, they were extremely ill. And so the village doctor, William Greggs, just said, I think they're bewitched. I think there's a couple of witches in our presence. And then other villagers slowly started to show similar symptoms because, science, that's how it works. But at the time, they believed Bridget was the first ever witch, and she was just cursing everybody around her. It was kind of the reason they kicked off the entire Salem witch hunt. It was all because of Bridget Bishop. Over the next few months, around 150 more folks were all convicted, all meeting their similar fate on Gallows Hill. Maybe it was Bridget Bishop, or maybe it was just rye disease. It's now referred to as St. Anthony's fire. You convulse, you experience delusions. Feels like bugs are under your skin. It's horrible. But these doctors didn't know that back then. Everybody just thought they were all cursed, that they were witches. No, they were not cursed. They just needed help. Oddly enough, in May 1693, just 1 year later, the Salem witch trials abruptly stopped. Did the town of Salem run out of witches, or did they run out of contaminated rye bread? I vote the latter. Me personally. Number 7, Malin Matt's daughter. Okay, sometimes in history, humans can be found guilty of practicing witchcraft. This is wild. This was like, Imagine that today. I've mentioned Giles Corey on this list before. He's a brave soul. But we also have to mention Malin Matsdaughter. She doesn't get the light as much as Giles does. It's one thing for a town to turn against you and call you a witch, but imagine family. That's exactly what happened to Malin Matsdaughter. She was a Swedish widow, and her own daughter told everybody that she was a witch. She was the last victim of the Great Swedish Witch Hunt in 1676, also known as the Great Noise. Malin goes down in history because 1, it was thankfully one of the last, but 2, she never admitted. Yeah, she didn't cry out in pain, she didn't beg for forgiveness. She said all this witchy nonsense was hogwash, and she stood by it too. What an OG. She was a champ. She was a badass. Her daughter was actually later found guilty of perjury, so later she met a similar fate. You know what I'm saying? What goes around comes around, like a witch flying on a broom in circles. Number 6, wedding season. Okay, we'll brighten the mood up a little bit. We'll start going this way in ancient history. Maybe you fantasized about your own big day, right? Maybe it's a beach wedding, maybe it's a themed wedding like a winter wonderland, maybe it's a nice ice palace. It's always fun, I guess. I'm Canadian, so I'm like, no, definitely, but I hear ya. It's your big day, okay? Get creative. They say the best month to get married is June. And again, from a Canadian point of view, I can absolutely agree. In ancient Roman times, however, getting married in June was a must. See, June was the month of the god Juno, and they protect women and life when it comes to marriage and childbirth. So if it's between that and Halloween, obviously we're gonna go with June, right? Better omens over here for sure. Another myth is that bathing was rarely done back then. So when majority of the population washed up at the end of May or the beginning of June, everybody smelt nice, right? Everyone felt good and they wanted to celebrate. So why not have weddings in this month as well, right after we have a little bubble bath or two. That's a myth, but I can also see it checking out. It does make sense. A June wedding in ancient Roman days was also done so that after a spring birth, the mother can hop back into action and help with that summer's harvest. Yeah, maternity leave? Never heard of it, sorry. Welcome to ancient history. It's the worst. Number 5, best man origins. I got asked to be a best man recently, so you know what? I have to share some love. I have to share some ancient best man love. It was a little different back then, that's for sure. Back in those days, the role of the best man normally goes to the guy who's closest to the groom. That's normal, whether that's a brother or a best friend. Back during the time where women were married off like property, the role of the best man was very different, and it was all about protecting one's assets rather than, you know, anything to do with love. Back then, bride kidnapping was so common that if there was somebody else who wanted to marry someone who was already promised to send someone else, they might try and steal her for themselves, right? It's awful. That's where the best man comes in. He's gotta watch for dudes hopping fences ready to steal your wife and run away. The best man's job was to protect the bride at all costs. And if she was stolen, the best man would be the one to enter whatever battle or duel was necessary to get the bride back. The best man was literally there to be the best fighter. That's wild. The best man was also there to watch over the bride to make sure she didn't try and make a run for it as well. It sounds okay at first, and then you're like, oh no, it's all horrible. History, of course. Number 4, ancient divorce. It happens sometimes. Weird. Almost like those marriages I just explained wouldn't work out all the time. Weird. Trial by combat. You've probably heard of this, right? We've all seen that Game of Thrones episode. The eyes and the... Yeah, that's a good one. That was the norm, right? You fight for your freedom. But what about divorce by combat? You ever heard of this? If you and your significant other weren't getting along back in the dark ages, instead of dishing out thousands on couples therapy and signing all that paperwork, instead you would battle each other in front of a crowd because why not? It's the medieval times. It was an organized event that included restrictions for the husband. Now it's pretty hilarious to think back on, but the husband would have to stand in a hole with one hand tied behind his back, while the wife, soon to be happy ex-wife, ran around in circles around said hole, also carrying a sack full of rocks, hitting the ex-husband with the rocks the whole time. Yeah, pretty intense and also pretty hilarious to think of. Yeah, that's why you don't cheat in the dark ages, Lancelot. Get out of here. A sack of rocks? Just take the castle, take the horse. I don't care, I'm out. I'll sign anything. I'll stamp anything. Number 3, the Battle of the Stray Dog. Okay, now we're gonna go back into some weird battles that we probably missed in school. I grew up with dogs my whole life, okay? It's stressful at times. You open the door for a second and all of a sudden your furry friends are running down the street after a blue jay and your heart's racing. Since the Second Balkan War in the early 1900s, Greece and Bulgaria were going head to head, right? At this point, there was a lot of conflict, a lot of emotions, tensions were of course high. But come October 1925, things finally escalated even more. A Greek soldier was chasing after his dog, who just decided to bolt randomly. But in doing so, he accidentally crossed the border into Bulgaria. So he was shot at, right? It was scary. The Greeks at that point were beyond upset, so they marched into Bulgaria and soon began a full-on war, all because of this dog, who saw a blue jay probably. By the time the International Committee negotiated a ceasefire to clear up the obvious misunderstanding, 50 people had already lost their lives. So yeah, keep those leashes on, please, unless you're in a off-leash dog park, because you might start a war. You never know. Number 2, the Battle of Los Angeles. Of course I have to mention this battle. This one's a little bit different, but you know, maybe some UFO stuff going on here. The Battle of Los Angeles, otherwise known as the Great LA Air Raid, happened during World War II, right at the end of February 1942. This event, first of all, it took place only a few months after the Pearl Harbor attack. So yeah, everybody was of course immensely stressed out at this point. And then something like 25 enemy aircraft was then spotted flying over LA in the late hours of February 24th. So now everyone's freaking out. Air raids went off, blackouts were in effect. This was not a drill, right? Artillery fire, machine guns, anti-aircraft shells. In total, around 1,400 shells were all fired off. 2 people had heart attacks. 5 people died in total from this retaliation, and it was all a false alarm. Yep. A press conference was held by the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, and he called the incident war nerves. Yeah. Oops. Thought I heard a noise. My bad. We'll just close that. No one touches anymore, I guess. War nerves. And finally, number 1, Battle of Zappolino. This one is pretty epic, okay? All over a bucket. Turning the calendars back to 1325, the Battle of Zappolino, it was a large-scale event all over a tiny bucket. And no, I'm not joking. The War of the Oaken Bucket. Now this war consisted of 2 Italian towns, Bologna and Modena. Now it all kicked off when soldiers from Modena snuck into Bologna with intentions to steal the wooden bucket from the city's well. Right? Resources were sparse back then, of course, so the Bolognese declared war, and then they sent in an invading force of 30,000 foot soldiers and 2,000 cavaliers. The city of Modena had a smaller army. They had 500 infantrymen and only 2,000 cavalry forces. But the thing is, those guys still won. They chased the larger army back to Bologna while destroying towns in the process. Now some recall them bringing the bucket back just to taunt the city, but right now the bucket is currently on display still in Modena, so it ended up finding its forever home there. And you can go check it out if you want. That many people kicked the bucket over this bucket. History is strange, my friend. Starting our list off at number 10, Lake Nias. We love talking about Pompeii. We can't get enough of it. I'm fascinated. They have a restaurant that's back and open now in Pompeii. It's crazy. Now that's quite the eruption. Historically, that's a bad one. That's pretty scary. But a recent eruption in 1986, well, we don't talk about this one enough. First of all, a limnic eruption is a rare event, so you can sleep not in fear tonight. It occurs when CO2 dissolved in deep water lakes suddenly erupts. Cause yeah, that can happen. Who knew that? That's why I don't like lakes. There you go, right there. These events have only been observed twice, the deadliest being Lake Nias in 1986. When a limnic eruption occurs, large clouds of CO2 form, which then all of a sudden descend and drop below the oxygen in the air, causing all living things in the vicinity to choke and not survive anymore. In this case, the cloud fell on nearby villages, ultimately causing the deaths of 1,700 people and 3,500 livestock. Number 9, the Great Dying. This name's pretty accurate if I'm being honest myself. Scariest environment imaginable. Here we go. Turning the clocks and solar system back 252 million years ago, the Permian Triassic extinction, which for convenience sake we'll call the Great Dying, was and hopefully shall remain the largest extinction event on Earth. The fact that we're even alive right now, watching this video, clicking that thumbs up and subscribing, well, it's all pretty rare, all things considered. This was a butterfly effect triggered by a massive volcanic eruption around the Serbian Traps in Russia. A runaway greenhouse effect was responsible for the loss of 95% of all marine life and 70% of all land animals. That's so everything, pretty much everything's gone. Temperatures rose as the sea began to absorb large quantities of CO2 from the atmosphere. Mentioned that a little earlier, and that could not be great. And it began turning into carbonic acid, hence all that marine life that didn't make it. Methane hydrate then started to bubble from the ocean surface, which is horrifying to imagine, and it raised the temperature even higher at that point. Now, imagine if this didn't happen. We'd have those scary sharks still swimming around. We're remnants of the surviving 4% of the Great Dying. Yeah, tell all your friends that. I'm gonna add that to my LinkedIn. That sounds not half bad. Yeah, I survived the Great Dying, so yeah. really good at scooping ice cream. Let's do it. Number 8, the Spanish flu of 1918. The Spanish flu of 1918. Okay, yeah, this one's probably pretty good. Since we know a little something about plagues now in real life and toilet paper and stress, let's turn the clocks back 95 years when the Spanish flu entered the game. What was it like back then? The Spanish flu, if you didn't know, it was a strain of the H1N1 virus, which we all know as well. And when it hit, it took 50 to 100 million people. Very fast. 4% of the world's population gone. Now, it was recent and it was quite horrible. We couldn't stay home and watch Ozark for that one, so instead, the Spanish flu is said to have spread so violently because of soldiers being in close quarters during World War I. Yeah, again, very different than our plague. Immune systems were shot as is, and you're telling me a plague rolled through while we're in trenches? No way, what a nightmare. But just like that, the virus disappeared. Better treatment, perhaps it mutated into a much weaker strain. Either way, great, stay gone. Get out of here. Go away and stay there, pal. Hit that thumbs up for the Spanish flu not being around. Awesome, we love that. It's a good one to not have. Number 7, Maximilian Robespierre. On July 27th, 1794, French revolutionary Maximilian Robespierre and 21 of his followers were all arrested at the Hotel de Ville in Paris. Now, considering that this was 1794 and we got arrested, what follows is sure to be a public nightmare. The next day, Robespierre and again 21 of his followers were all taken to the Place de Revolution, where they were all executed by guillotine before a cheering crowd. Always a cheering crowd, of course. What else are we doing today? Let's go watch. What history tends to leave out of this part is that Maximilian attempted to take his own life beforehand because he knew his fate was gonna suck with the whole, thing. But when he tried to take his own life, he survived and was left instead with a nasty jaw wound. So in Game of Thrones fashion, the executioner, when the time came, ripped the jaw bandage off first, and then he saw the guillotine. Yeah, again, to a cheering crowd, remember? They all watched all of this unfold. I can't even watch UFC sometimes. You're telling me people watch this? IRL? I'm gonna go throw up real quick. Be right back. Number 6, the eruption. Mount Pinatubo, which is located in the Philippines, was another volcanic eruption that shook up history. A little more recent than the other one. This was on June 15th, 1991. Mount Pinatubo, this massive volcano, erupted into what would be the second largest volcanic eruption of the 20th century. Impressive? Yes. Terrifying? Absolutely. Yep, this is very loud and scary. Activity in the volcano first started on April 2nd, 1991, and these things take a little time to, finish up. So that same year, researchers set up seismographs in the area, and by June, the volcano was having a group of progressively shallower eruptions. And then on June 12th, the volcano had its first spectacular eruption, which sent hot ash 19 kilometers up into the atmosphere, which then rained on down to everything around it, which is the worst thing I can imagine. Additional smaller eruptions continued on June 13th, which then led to some intense seismic activity. And then on June 15th, the volcano once again went off, this time sending a cloud of ash 40 kilometers into the atmosphere. So bye-bye sun for a little bit. This one's gonna linger. Number 5, the Challenger crew. This is a photo that was taken of clearly the very excited Challenger crew right before when they were walking down the ramp ready to head off on their mission. Now, this photo is chilling, but it's nice to see them happy and together. The crew even included, at the time, 37-year-old Kristen McAuliffe, who was a high school social studies teacher. You may remember this, but your parents definitely do. See, she had won a spot on the mission through a program with NASA called the Teacher in Space program, and she had trained diligently for months in order to be the first ever non-military individual in space. On January 28th, 1986, the Challenger mission proved to be faithful just 73 seconds after liftoff. See, 2 rubber O-rings failed because of the cold temperatures that morning, and on live television, the world had to watch as a spacecraft broke apart and then fell into the ocean, sadly taking the lives of everybody on board the craft. Now, I'm not sure if you've watched the documentary on Netflix, but it's a mini-series about this whole thing and it's powerful stuff. It's really emotional. I just finished it and it's moving. Number 4, the core. This photo shows a physicist named Harold Agnew, and while this photo looks relatively normal and scientific or whatever, a non-threatening photo, what he has in his hands is truly devastating. It changed history. Harold is holding the nuclear core of what was nicknamed the Fat Man. Yeah, that thing. This means that Harold is now holding the nuclear core of the atomic weapon that was later dropped on Nagasaki in 1945. The immediate blast took many many lives, as well as the long-term effects of radiation illnesses. Now it's crazy to look at a photo like this because it seems so perfectly normal when he literally has a life-changing, world-ending device in the palm of his hand, like a literal supervillain holding kryptonite. I couldn't imagine seeing that, let alone holding it. No way. My grandmother wouldn't even hold me as a baby because I was too small and fragile. Think she'd hold this? No way. Butterfingers. Butterfingers galore over there. Number 3, the Ball of Burning Men. January 28th, 1393. You are formally invited to a masquerade ball. How fun is that? Who is it under that mask? Oh, it's just Taylor on Bumblebee. Love him. He's great. The French Queen Isabeau of Bavaria is now hosting one of the most lavish parties of the decade, right? So bring your finest and longest krakows. Roll it in style. Now, when the French royal court was celebrating the marriage of one of the Queen's ladies in waiting, it of course was a big deal. It's fun. It's a big happy day. For some, the best days of their lives. For others at this ball, not so great. Probably the last days of their lives. King Charles VI had 5 companions perform a dance or a theater routine of sorts. Now they did a performance as beasts. They were committed to the bit, right? They had these big, lovely masks, big baggy outfits, lots of linen, lots of stuffing to appear as if they were real beasts. Now the party was going well, wine was spilling, people were laughing, beasts were roaring, we were committed, but one rule beforehand was put into place before the party started. Absolutely, positively, no open flames. Obviously, right? I mean, look at that guy. He looks like a couch. We're not gonna put a match near him. It's gonna be chaos. The Duke of Orleans had a little too much fun prior to this event, and he forgot the first rule of Fight Club when he arrived. The guy walked in with a lit torch. He wanted to see everyone. Some accounts say he dropped the torch by accident. Others say he got too close trying to guess the identity of said beasts. Either way, this tragic event took the lives of 4 people, hence the name Ball of the Burning Men. That's terrible, imagine that, what a gig. Number 2, the Stanford Prison Experiment. One of the most well-known experiments of all time was the Stanford Prison Experiment. It was an attempt to investigate the psychological effects of perceived power, and it worked. A little too well, I'd say. Guards and prisoners were all chosen randomly, from college students to anyone, your neighbor. You had no idea. Nobody really knew just how bad this experiment would end up, so anyone volunteered. Those in power were taking it to an extreme level. It was absolute psychological distress. Some of the prisoners went insane. The whole exercise was abandoned after only 6 days, which is not a short amount of time, but historians say just 6 days because it was intended to last much longer. Now, it's shocking to see the lengths people go after receiving power over another human being. I thought I was evil unplugging my brother's controller and like playing, you know, and he wasn't plugged in. This is like next level. And finally, number 1, mummified pets. Are you a pet owner? If so, comment down below which animals fill your house. We love that. Olivia and I want to get a dog so bad. I was always a dog guy growing up. My aunt had 3 pugs. It was the dream. I love it. Ancient Egyptians, they fancied a house pet or two. We know this. But Egyptians saw animals as incarnations of the gods, which I do too with my Shih Tzu, of course. The very concept of having a pet came from ancient Egyptians, so thank you. Egyptians were of course fans of cats. That's common knowledge at this point. But did you know they also had the same idea for hawks, lions, dogs, and baboons? Yeah, baboons. That's amazing. Go ask your parents for a baboon as a pet. There you go. I thought dogs doing their business inside was annoying, but a lion? Your arm's gonna be tired scooping that one up. Many of these animals were often mummified and buried with their owners after they had passed, just like how many owners today cremate their pets. I mean, I'm not sure I would mummify a Shih Tzu, but hey, whatever floats your boat. Who am I to judge?
Starting off with some geography, we got Lake Nias. How can a lake kill 1,700 people? Well, though it sounds too insane to be true, it did indeed happen. Located in West Africa, the lake itself is deceptively beautiful. However, on August 21st, 1986, a mysterious cloud burst from the lake. It flooded towards the village and suffocated 1,700 people and animals. Nothing survived the event. The reason this happened is because beneath the water there is a pocket of magma that leaks carbon dioxide into the lake. The CO2 stays dissolved in the water due to the pressure of the 650 feet of water on top of the magma secretions. Crazy, so kind of like a pop bottle with an invisible lid. Until one day, that lid popped. On that day, the lake abruptly depressurized and the CO2 exploded into the air, causing the devastating event. Today, pipes are used to siphon the CO2 out from the bottom of the lake in order to prevent this from happening again, but imagine when it did happen, it must have felt like some kind of magical grim occurrence. For sure. Number 9. Unsinkable Sam. On a happier note, this is the kind of story that makes people believe that cats have 9 lives. Unsinkable Sam was the nickname for a cat who survived several shipwrecks during World War II. His tale begins aboard a German warship called the Bismarck. Among the 2,200 soldiers was a black and white cat that somehow snuck aboard. One day, the Bismarck was decimated during an attack, and while the HMS Cossack was looking for survivors, they saw Oscar the cat, name of the time, seeking refuge on a plank, like Jack from the Titanic. They hauled him aboard, but then several months later, the Cossack would be decimated. That's shipwreck number 2. This time it was the HMS Ark Royale who spotted him and was then dubbed the name Unsinkable Sam. And then, shipwreck number 3. Months later, as you can guess, the Royale was torpedoed, and once again, Sam was saved by the HMS Legion of the British Royal Fleet. Finally, this seafaring feline retired to land and later died in 1955. Number 8. The Salem Witch Trials. If you follow me on MA, you just know how much I hate the Salem Witch Trials. I hate them so much, okay? It's an event in history that is so inconceivably stupid, it's hard to believe it actually happened. The Salem Witch Trials occurred in Massachusetts between 1692 and 1693, where more than 200 people were accused of witchcraft and 20 were put to death. It all started because the daughter of Reverend Paris, Elizabeth, who was 9, and his niece, Abigail Williams, same age, started having fits. Another girl, Ann Putnam, age 11, started having them as well. The supernatural was blamed, and soon the girls began accusing everyone they could, mostly people the town didn't like. Basically, if you confessed and you wanted to be saved, then you weren't executed, but if you were accused and didn't confess, you were killed. The paranoia was so bad that once you were accused, you couldn't escape this guilt they put on you. It was insane. But after the paranoia finally subsided, the colony admitted that they probably made a mistake and compensated the families. Like, yeah, oops, might have gotten a little carried away there. Wow, whew, I got excited, sorry guys. Here's some money. The Salem Witch Trials today represent what happens when paranoia rules a courtroom and the whole thing still beguiles the world even 300 years later. Number 7. Nelly Bly. Nelly Bly is a woman right out of a Jules Verne novel. In fact, you would think so if she hadn't met the man himself. In 1889, Nelly Bly took on a record-breaking voyage by traveling around the world in just 72 days. Her means of travel included a train, a steamship, a rickshaw, horse, and donkey. Her goal was to beat the fictional record set by Verne's hero Phileas Fogg in his 80-day Odyssey. An event like this already appeared as a myth to the men of the time. Her editor at the New York World nearly refused to send her because her gender would make the trip impossible. No one but a man could do this, he told her. Very well, she replied. Start the man and I'll start the same day for some other newspaper and beat him. He backed down, and eventually Nelly was on her way, turning fiction into reality. Number 6. The Black Museum. No, I'm not talking about the Black Museum episode of Black Mirror, but honestly, not too far off. People have done some pretty vicious things to their enemies. There's a long list, but imagine turning your enemies into a permanent dinner guest. Because that's exactly what Ferdinand I of Naples actually did. Though everyone thought he was going to be a great king, he actually ended up being pretty psychotic. He would invite his enemies over for dinner, and while they gorged on pheasant, he would take them out, either the old-fashioned way, or literally throw them out of a window. He would then retrieve and dress the bodies and stage them. He called it his Black Museum and would invite new acquaintances to view it so they would know exactly who they were dealing with, so not to mess with him. What a psycho! Number 5. Sir Adrian Cotton DeWalt. Love that name. There are gonna be a couple unbelievable events on this list from World War II, so just a heads up. But truth be told, the war itself is kind of hard to believe. Sir Adrian Cotton DeWalt was not only a man who survived the impossible once, but he made a career out of it. He wasn't like your Blackadder general in the back with a pipe. This dude was on the front lines tossing grenades with one arm because he already lost the other. He served in the Boer War, World War I, and World War II. He survived being shot in the face, skull, hip, leg, ankle, and ear. One eye and one arm short, this enthusiastic war hero dove into the bloodshed again and again. He was seen pulling pins out of grenades and throwing them with his one good arm during Battle of the Somme. But even as a 60-year-old man, he was still a beast. His plane got shot down in April 1941, he crashed it into the Mediterranean, survived, swam all the way to shore, then he got captured by Italian soldiers, thrown into a POW camp, then he escaped, eluded capture for 8 days, but unfortunately the lack of Italian looks gave him away. He was released 2 years later, and Churchill was such a big fan of him, he made him his rep over in China. He ended up passing away peacefully at age 83. Despite hundreds of close calls with death. Number 4, Simo Heiha. This is actually kind of a plug for a short film I'm looking to raise funds for. Check out my Instagram to learn more. But his story is incredible and it's so unbelievable. Simo Heiha's story sounds like something straight out of a movie, except it actually happened. A humble Finnish farmer who became the Soviets' nightmare in World War II. He is widely regarded as one of the most accomplished and skilled snipers in history. The Winter War began in Finland in 1939 after Russia decided that it was time to regain some territory. They thought it was going to be easy. But soon they came to fear the man who would be known as the White Death. He was trained as a sniper at a young age, didn't want to take human lives though, so he just became a farmer, but the lives of his countrymen were at stake. The Winter War lasted just over 100 days, and within that time, Simo hit as many as 500 men, his personal best being 40 confirmed hits in one day. Some people estimate that it was over 800 people. In March 1940, he was hit in the jaw by a counter sniper, leaving him in a coma for 11 days. But when he awoke, however, the Russians surrendered. That is poetic justice. Number 3, Alexander the Great. How did this guy exist? Was he the son of Zeus? The case is so convincing that even Alexander believed it himself. During the 15 years of his conquest, starting from his first victory when he was 18, Alexander never lost a battle. He was so prolific in battle that his strategies are still studied to this day. Before Alexander entered Egypt, they had been under Persian rule for just over 200 years. Through his incredible prowess and lightning-quick decision-making, Alexander defeated them. Egypt was so happy they even claimed him as their pharaoh. While he was in Egypt, however, Alexander decided to make the long trek to visit the shrine of Zeus Ammon. According to the man himself, he was guided there by ravens, and it even rained during his journey, which was interpreted as a blessing. When he got there, the priest named him a son of Zeus. Now, if that doesn't make this guy sound like a myth, then I don't know what will. Number 2, Bodacia. Bodacia is the Morrigan in my mind. She is Xena, warrior princess. This woman was so ferocious, she was called the scourge of the Roman Empire. Yeah, that's right, this queen took on the Roman Empire. At the time Rome was invading the south of Britain, Queen Bodacia ruled the Iceni tribe of East Anglia, along her husband King Prasutagus. Though her early days remain mostly a mystery, she remains among the canon of heroes who defended the British Isles. She was fearsome to behold, with flaming red hair and a gaze so sharp it could cut glass. She and her husband fought against the Romans until his death, after which the Romans drove straight to take her on. They attacked her daughters publicly, which, like Mother Bear, not a good idea, after which she toured in a chariot rallying the people in rebellion. She sacked 3 Roman cities and took no prisoners. She annihilated the 9th Legion when she took out their entire relief force. Sadly though, Bodacia fell after a vicious battle, but her name echoes in the halls of heroes. And last but not least, Richard, Saladin, and the Third Crusade. Just the Crusades in general are just unbelievable. Never in history have 2 rulers been so equally matched. Currently I'm reading Warriors of God, Richard the Lionheart and Saladin and the Third Crusade by James Rustin, and the fact that everything I've read so far isn't just the next Game of Thrones novel astounds me. These 2 never met because Saladin believed that kings should not go to war if they had met, but because they were fighting over the Holy Land, war was kind of inevitable. But while Saladin did not engage in warfare, Richard dove right in the middle of everything. They both had such incredible admiration for each other that in the middle of battles, they would send each other gifts. Like, I don't understand. You killed my men. You killed my men. Here's a fruit basket. Literally happened. And another example, during the Battle of Jaffa, Richard's horse ended up being killed, and Saladin was so impressed with him that he sent him 2 new ones. 2! On top of that, Richard had taken off half of his armor before he had left ashore to fight. So he was basically half naked. Eventually Saladin tried to have him assassinated, but Richard was so ferocious in battle that everyone feared him. The dude was pretty much a human bulldozer. The two assassins ended up waking up the camp because they were fighting about who should take the guy out.
Number 10, an apple a day. If you threw an apple at somebody today, that would be assault. Yeah, you're not allowed to do that. You can't huck food at people. Now, then, ever. Let's just not do that anymore. But in ancient Greek days, it was a little different, dare I say. The apple, back then, had quite the symbolism attached to it. The apple was sacred to Aphrodite. This was a symbol for the goddess of love. So, to throw an apple at somebody, that meant you were throwing your heart at them, right? How romantic is that? Just a nice apple with bugs in it. You're like, here you go, there's lunch. Ancient flirting, my friend. The more you know. Maybe those trees in The Wizard of Oz weren't mean. Maybe they weren't mean at all. Maybe they were just trying to express their love by throwing apples aggressively at everyone involved. Number 9, raining iguanas. Okay, we're immediately dipping back into the weird side of this list. Here we go. Back in 2018, this was wild. I read about this and I'll never forget. Lives rent-free right in my head. Florida got another odd headline. There you go, classic Florida. This time it was frozen iguanas falling from the skies. Yeah, how do you not pick up that paper, right? Florida got hit with a massive snowfall, their first big one in 28 years. So these cold-blooded guys started to fall from suburban tree branches, right? They didn't see it coming at all. People were just walking to get groceries and iguanas are freezing and falling off trees right in front of them. The craziest thing is that they're just paralyzed. They're not dead, obviously. So later, they would come back to life after they, you know, de-thaw. Sounds so zombie-like when you say it like that. They're just lying there and then all of a sudden they're like, what day is it? Was it a snowfall? Oh god. Winter has come. Number 8, the Philadelphia experiment. Okay, a little more darker. Let's do it. Perhaps one of the most bizarre tales when it comes to other dimensions. This one has credibility behind it. It pops up on my Reddit feed a lot, so I can't help but not talk about it. The 1943 Philadelphia experiment. This World War II conspiracy theory takes place on the USS Eldridge, this destroyer-class ship. So it wasn't small, it was quite large. A lot of people on board, a lot of heads, a lot of witnesses. And they were conducting on this ship these secret experiments in order to gain power over naval warfare, obviously at the time. Now, one of these experiments was to create this technology that makes the ship invisible on radar. That's the important note. It was supposed to be invisible on radar. But when the generators were fired up, the hull apparently lit up with this green and blue light. Then the ship itself actually disappeared. Invisible in real life, not just on radar. Boom, gone, just like that. It was then seen at a naval shipyard in Virginia before the same thing happened again, and then it appeared back in Philadelphia. Now this sounds a bit intense, but when you hear about the crew on board, it only gets worse. Some went mad after the dimensional dip, of course, while others had physical effects from this cosmic commute. Yeah, some haunting details in that one. Some body parts that got mixed up with... Yeah, I can't even talk about it. You get it. If you've seen the Cloverfield paradox, it's kind of like that. Some blooping and blipping, and then some arms getting stuck in some walls. There you go. Number 7, Ellen Shannon. Heading over to the late 1800s for this one. I gotta warn you, it's of course pretty dark. In 1870, we obviously didn't have the same safety requirements as we do today for anything, like at all. For example, if you wanted to read before bed, you didn't have a Kindle or an iPad. Hell, you didn't even have a nightlight, but you did have a kerosene lamp. Always coming in handy, those kerosene lamps. See, Ellen had used R.E. Danforth's non-reactive burning fluid. And dare I say, the obvious happened. The fluid reacted. Yeah, her tomb in Pennsylvania reads, in memory of Ellen Shannon, aged 26 years old, who was fatally burned March 21st, 1870, by the reaction of a lamp filled with R.E. Danforth's non-reactive burning fluid. Yeah, they just called him out right there, right in public on the actual tomb. I gotta say, I agree with that. That's cool. If some idiot's gonna cause your horrible demise, yeah, roast them. Let people know. Let people know who's responsible. That's like Twitter nowadays, you know what I mean? It's like, yeah, this so-and-so is an asshole. Send tweet. Boop. It's there forever. Number 6, military dolphins. Yep, I said military dolphins. Here we are, we're almost halfway through our list. We'll get a little more weird now. Iran has plenty of nuclear capabilities, but they also have trained dolphins now too, so good game, folks. Back in 2000, Iran bought this fleet of trained dolphins from Russia. Just Russians doing things. But they were trained, supposedly by the Soviet Union, to attack ships, and yes, you guessed it, attack people. We have Navy SEALs and military dolphins. Is this Aquaman 2? What's happening right now? Well, recently, and I mean that as in 2018 recent, satellite photos revealed a Russian naval base in Syria with pens that are commonly used for holding dolphins. Yeah, so these dolphins are active, perhaps, right now. That's so terrifying. Russia and the US have a fleet of trained dolphins to detect mines, but now Iran is also in the mix as well. So 3 powers in the dolphin game. What an odd standoff that would be in the water. They're all eating at each other. Number 5, Abel and Baker. Okay, we often remember Laika the space dog and her 103-minute cosmic journey aboard Sputnik 2. But does anybody remember Abel and Baker? Why don't we talk about these two enough? This was the American version of Laika. This was less than 2 years right after that. It was May 28th, 1959. The United States launched 2 female primates. They launched Abel and Baker into space. This mission only lasted 15 minutes and they both safely returned back home. That's wild to me. The monkeys weren't injured from the cosmic commute at all. A radio message came in shortly right after they splashed down in the Atlantic, and the message said, no injuries or other difficulties. Thank the Lord, we love that. Abel and Baker, perfect, as they said. I don't think we can blast any more primates into space going 10,000 miles an hour anymore, but it's wild to me that we did this ever. This is insane. A human had to strap in a chimp into a rocket ship and be like, all right, see ya. And then, that's insane. Grown adults had to do that. That's insane. Abel sadly passed away shortly after the flight. Nothing to do with the actual flight itself, just timing. Meanwhile, Baker, she got famous. She was getting 150 fan letters a day. Imagine if she had Twitter. Oh, it'd be wild. These ladies are icons. Never mind Laika, okay? Hit that thumbs up for Abel and then subscribe for Baker. They went in space. That's crazy. Number 4, asteroid redirection. Speaking of space, this one has Michael Bay written all over it. I can't wait. I'm pretty excited for this project. I can't even catch a baseball with my hands. You're telling me NASA is gonna catch an asteroid hurling through space? This is the future. We've arrived. NASA landing on an asteroid is one thing. Sure, that's, you know, a Michael Bay movie. But their asteroid redirection mission, that's a whole nother level. This coming Monday, as in like 4 days from now, I don't know, NASA is gonna broadcast its first attempt to modify the orbit of an asteroid, hurling through space. This is real life. And before you start to panic, no, there's no way any debris can hit the Earth after said test. But if an asteroid was coming for Earth, well, now we have a backup plan to hopefully, ideally, save the human race and the planet. That would be helpful. That's always handy. The planetary defense team is using a craft called DART, just sending a dart out there. You got a dart? Awesome. Double asteroid redirection test, DART, which will ideally target the asteroid Dimorphos and then altering its orbit. And we can tune in live to watch the whole thing on Monday, because that's where we're at in the future. We can just tune in live and watch Jake Paul fight someone or watch an asteroid get blasted off of its course. How are you spending your afternoon this Monday? Number 3, mass extinctions. Are we part of the 6th extinction? I mean, we're talking about asteroids getting blasted away from Earth. It kind of feels like it. It kind of feels like something's nearing us. It's happening right now, isn't it? We lose thousands of species every year, and when looking in the past, sure, asteroids and ice ages, they've all caused these massive extinction level events, of course. But after humans invented the wheel and discovered fire and, you know, became the worst things ever to exist, things started to change naturally. In the 1800s, industrialization drove up extinction rates and continues to do so, obviously. We're not helping the planet by any means. And according to Elizabeth Colbert, across the world, scientists every day are monitoring what could be the largest extinction event since the dinosaurs. Right now. It's happening right now. The way human beings interact with the environment and affect biodiversity, it could be more deadly than an asteroid hitting the Earth. That's a fun, scary fact. Okay. With an ever-climbing list of endangered species, Colbert and the world ask the question, is it too late to change it? Kind of feels like it's too late. Okay, let's move on to something a little more lighter so we don't feel like complete trash. Deal? Deal. Number 2, relaxative. Okay, so right off the bat, the Victorian era was a little messy. I'm sure you figured this out by now, but these messy illnesses were putting a lot of pressure on medical practitioners back in the Victorian day, so they were desperate for new treatments. Sometimes I laugh at Victorian medical treatments, but they tried. And they also achieved many medical breakthroughs, one that I saved for number 1. But when it came to handling chickenpox in the Victorian era, that wasn't our finest hour. No, we didn't figure that one out, I don't think, right off the bat. Chickenpox in the Victorian era was being treated by using laxatives. Yeah, just let that sink in for a second. I have chickenpox. What should I do, doc? Just go take a shit. Or 6, I don't know, might help. Yeah, folks would slam some castor oil and then, ready for this? They would get even more sick. Yeah, who would have thought, right? You thought you were uncomfortable before. Well, not even close. Not every answer was a solution in the Victorian era. But this one was. And finally, number 1, the discovery of penicillin. Thank God this one happened. We'll still talk about this one because it's A really good one. Sometimes miracles happen when nobody is in the room or no one's looking. That's ideally the best time. Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin back in 1928. Now at the time, he was actually studying Staphylococcus, which is bacteria that causes infections and boils and all that nasty stuff. But right before Alexander left for a well-earned 2-week vacation, he left a petri dish with some of that Staphylococcus right there on the table, just sitting there. Rather than, you know, store it away in an incubator, he just accidentally left it out. Now during this time off, a penicillium mold, the spore just drifted in there, either through a window or up the lab stairwell, some Horton Hears a Who type commute. It drifted in there, and the temperatures of the room and the lack of one Alexander Fleming allowed for the mold to fight back. And then miracles literally happened. It then prevented that bacteria from growing anymore. So he returned and discovered this antibacterial substance was only produced by strains of penicillium. So now we have a solution that isn't a laxative. You know what I mean? Now we have some things that help us out medicinally. Yeah, we got asteroids, some medicines, some horrible history, some dark tragic events. We got it all in this list, really. I don't know how to tell you that.
Number 10. The Doomsday Book, 1085. The Doomsday Book was created under William I, also known as William the Conqueror. Like, you're already the first, man. You don't need 2 names, come on. This guy basically drew up a book to document people's money so that he could tax them. Oh yeah, this is the very first time surveyors went town to town and recorded how much money you would owe for simply just doing you. Men would show up at your house asking how much money you made and document your spending habits. 5 shillings on groceries, huh? Okay. And 5 on that phone plan. Look, tax season's coming up, Arthur. It's not looking good, man. Talk about a bunch of crooks, huh? Imagine owing someone money for just trying to make an honest living. Yeah, thank God that didn't catch on, right guys? Oh, speaking of, I gotta phone H&R Block. Number 9, The Crusades. A 3-part miniseries spanning over 200 years. These bloody and ruthless wars were battled between Muslim and Christians for the proprietorship over sacred sites and the land in the East Mediterranean. A 3-part miniseries spanning over 200 years. These bloody and ruthless wars were battled between Muslim and Christians for proprietorship over sacred sites and land in the East Mediterranean. Wars that resulted in 6 million deaths. The Knights Templar, a brotherhood of highly trained soldiers horseback bashing their way through the East. These guys were the real deal, almost like the Navy SEALs of their time. We've seen these paintings. The elite fighting force with the red cross painted on their chests. I wonder if they had to do a Hell Week. These soldiers were the most trained and savage fighters in all the Christian armies. Richard I leading the 3rd and final crusade, earning him the name Richard the Lionheart. Back then the names were always something so aggressive and scary. It was never like Richard the Clownfish or Henry the Pygmy Goat. No, we need fear. Way more fear. Number 8, the Magna Carta. The year's 1215. We need some laws, people. This document was one of its kind. A document setting out the laws and limitations from the common man to King John himself. A legal system written down so that there are clear do's and don'ts. No free man shall be seized, imprisoned, dispossessed, outlawed, exiled, or ruined in any way, nor in any way proceeded against except by the lawful judgment of his peers, and the law of the land. Did you get all that? Write that down. Except women, they don't have laws. And they can't act in plays. Sometimes people needed to face the music. And even animals. Huh? That's right, animals. Being tried in a court. A lively and popular event trying any law-breaking animal from goats to pigs to even chickens. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, did you, Mr. Feathersworth, peck the floor, yes or no? Objection, Your Honor, leading the witness. My brain can't fathom this, guys. Number 7, the Battle of Bannockburn. This infamous battle between Scotland and England was one of the most important battles of the Middle Ages. The end of the bloody war for independence. Basically, Scotland was like, yeah, we're gonna go over here and roll our R's. The gruesome wooden wars were caused by the English invading Scotland in 1296. A leader slowly rising the ranks, William Wallace, the guardian of the King of Scotland himself, holds off the English forces and is knighted a hero to Scotland. Unfortunately, like every hero back then, he was also hated. He was captured, hanged, drawn, and quartered. Like, why do you have to do all that after he dies? Like, he's dead. Not fun. The battles between Scotland and England ended in 1314 with Robert the Bruce securing Scotland's independence, adding like 45 more dialects to the UK. Freedom! Number 6, the Black Death. Ooh, talk about a curveball. The year's 1348. People are saying things like, Don't let the bed bugs bite. Clearly not a very clean and safe time. The Black Death, aka pestilence, aka the Great Mortality, or simply known as the Plague. Single-handedly the worst pandemic ever recorded in history, wiping out somewhere between 70 to 200 million people. Ooh, now I get where bless you comes from. Someone sneezed back then and everyone's dead at 14. This is where we see those doctors in the terrifying bird outfits with the long noses stuffed with garlic and herbs. Excuse me? Yeah, he's not wearing a mask. I'm just trying to watch a cat publicly get skinned. Yeah, 6 feet please. Some doctors prescribed urinating on a person so that the bad smell would drive out the infection. Can you imagine? Just a doctor writing you up a script and go ahead and pee on yourself about 4 to 5 times a day. Take with food. Should be gone early next week. And just let me put my mask back on here before you leave. There you are. The plague started in Europe in October 1347 when 12 ships from the Black Sea docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. Most sailors aboard the ships were already dead, but those who were still alive were covered head to toe in black boils that oozed pus and blood. Ugh. Sometimes the Black Death included fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, temporary loss in motor skills, and then of course, death. Number 5. Joan of Arc. Finally, a woman in the Middle Ages. Who'da thunk? Joan of Arc was considered and still is revered the heroine of France for her role in the Siege of Orleans during France's 100-year war with England. Joan of Arc, a peasant with faith on her side, had believed that God had chosen her to lead France in victory against England and had spoken to her since she was young. At only age 17, she had stolen men's armors, a white horse, and like a Valkyrie riding into battle, she had convinced an entire army that she was appointed by God to win. And then did! That's the most badass thing I've ever heard in my entire life. After such a miraculous victory, her reputation spread among France, and upon her capture and death at 19, the Maid of Orleans herself would forever live on as one of the greatest saints and symbols of the country of France. Number 4. Henry V. Another war? All these people do is kill each other. Does anyone fish? Or golf? No one, huh? Just swords and heads, swords and heads. A history itself. This time, England beats France. King Henry V, Prince Hal himself, leans into his kingly duties, demolishing France in what Shakespeare would delve into years to come. The Battle of Agincourt is one of England's most celebrated victories and was one of the most important triumphs in the 100 Years' War. Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, assume the port of Mars, and at his heels, leashed in like hounds, should famine, sword, and fire crouch for employment. Henry V. Prologue. Good stuff. How come these guys didn't just like rap battle or play soccer or something? Like an arrow right through the chest is way worse than a red card, just saying. Hey, speaking of soccer. Number 3, mob football. I'm not talking about the mafia. Put 1,000 on Brady, would you? I'm talking about mob football, also known as folk football. It's just like our modern day soccer. Town versus town. Except it has an unlimited amount of players. And there's only 2 rules to the game. Get the inflated pig's bladder over the opposing team's lines on the other side of town, and no murdering. I mean, I guess this is closer to rugby? Yeah, this is literally just rugby. This game was played competitively and eventually outlawed at Oxford University in 1555. Just a guy named Jeeves in a polo. Oh yeah, I play mob football at Oxford. Yeah, I'm also in a frat. This game got so out of hand it was banned numerous times in England. There is great noise in the city caused by hustling over large balls from which many evils may arise which God forbid. We command and forbid on behalf of the king, on pain of imprisonment, such game to be used in the city of the future. Thankfully this game has calmed down over the years and now has become the most popular played and watched game across the world. Go Liverpool! Number 2, the printing press. The printing press is a machine that was designed for the mass printing of text, mostly in form of books and newspapers. With an unknown date of origin, first invented in China, this machine designed in the 15th century by Johannes Gutenberg was a revolutionary new form of writing which would only change the direction of history with the mass production of uniform text. Long story short, people didn't have to get the world's worst wrist cramp writing Hamlet over and over again. To be, or not to be, 86 more folios? The alphabetical metal keys would be placed into the device and slammed into the paper, pressing ink upon the parchment. You know there's gotta be some books half written in purple ink because they just ran out of black. Come on, we've all been there. Ink's expensive. Number 1, William Shakespeare. The Bard himself, arguably the most influential writer of the English language. William Shakespeare was born in Stratford, England. one of the easiest ways we can look back into the dialogue and lifestyle used by the people living in the Middle Ages. This playwright documents the world in which he lives from 1564 to 1616. Due to Shakespeare's unbelievable talent for building and fabricating an array of diverse stories and characters via players, modern day is able to see the Middle Ages and the similarities and differences the people were experiencing. His plays are based in the environment that they were written in. He writes about diseases, he writes about monarchy, he writes about women's rights. Okay, so no one actually got turned into a donkey by some fairies in the woods, but some of those wars actually did happen, and some of those kings and queens were really twisted. How this man created so many brilliant works and stories, all part of the mystery.